Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to Life, Liberty, and My Two Cents. A very happy 4th of July for all the American patriots out there. Today is the celebration of our independence. And how are we going to do that this evening? We will continue in the reading of the 1776 report, starting on Chapter 4, Challenges to America's Principles. Before I get started, though, I do take feedback into consideration, and I will try and keep this recording around 15 minutes instead of the last 33 minutes that the first part took. If you did not listen to part 1 of the 1776 report or the video prior to that where we discussed the 1619 project and the 1776 report, I highly suggest that you check those videos out first. So let's go ahead and get started. So, as I said, Chapter 4, Challenges to America's Principles. Challenges to constitutional government are frequent and to be expected in a popular government based on consent. In his farewell address, George Washington advised his countrymen that when it came to the preservation of the Constitution, they should resist with care and spirit of innovation upon its principles, however specious the pretexts. The Constitution has proven sturdy against narrow interest groups that seek to change elements of the Constitution merely to get their way. At the same time, it is important to note that by design there is room in the Constitution for significant change and reform. Indeed, great reforms like abolition, women's suffrage, anti-communism, the civil rights movement, and the pro-life movement have often come forward that improve our dedication to the principles of the Declaration of Independence under the Constitution. More problematic have been movements that reject the fundamental truths of the Declaration of Independence and seek to destroy our constitutional order. The arguments, tactics, and names of these movements have changed, and the magnitude of the challenge has varied, yet they're all united by adherence to the same falsehood, that people do not have equal worth and equal rights. At the infancy of our republic, the threat was a despotic king who violated the people's rights and overthrew the colonists' long-standing tradition of self-government. After decades of struggle, the colonists succeeded in establishing a more perfect union, founded not upon the capricious whims of a tyrant, but republican laws and institutions founded upon self-evident and eternal truths. It is the sacred duty of every generation of American patriots to defend this priceless inheritance. Slavery. The most common charge leveled against the founders and hence against our country itself is that they were hypocrites who didn't believe in their stated principles, and therefore the country they built rests on a lie. This charge is untrue and has done enormous damage, especially in recent years, with a devastating effect on our civic unity and social fabric. Many Americans labor under the illusion that slavery was somehow a uniquely American evil. It is essential to insist at the outset that the institution be seen in a much broader perspective. It is very hard for people brought up in the comforts of modern America in a time in which the idea that all human beings have inviolable rights and inherent dignity is almost taken for granted, to imagine the cruelties and enormities that were endemic in earlier times. But the unfortunate fact is that the institution of slavery has been more the rule than the exception throughout human history. It was the Western world's repudiation of slavery, only just beginning to build at the time of the American Revolution, which marked a dramatic sea change in moral sensibilities. The American founders were living on the cusp of this change in a manner that straddled two worlds. George Washington owned slaves, but came to detest the practice and wished for a plan adopted for the abolition of it. By the end of his life, he freed all the slaves in his family estate. Thomas Jefferson also held slaves, and yet included in his original draft of the Declaration a strong condemnation of slavery, which was removed at the insistence of certain slaveholding delegates. Inscribed in marble at his memorial in Washington, D.C., is Jefferson's foreboding reference to the injustice of slavery. I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. James Madison saw to it at the Constitutional Convention that even when the Constitution compromised with slavery, it never used the word slave to do so. No mere semantics, he insisted that it was wrong to admit in the Constitution the idea that there could be property in men. Indeed, the compromises at the Constitutional Convention were just that, compromises. The Three-Fifths Compromise was proposed by an anti-slavery delegate to prevent the South from counting their slaves as whole persons for purposes of increasing their congressional representation. The so-called Fugitive Slave Clause, perhaps the most hated protection of all, accommodated pro-slavery delegates but was written so that the Constitution did not sanction slavery in the states where it existed. There is also the provision in the Constitution that forbade any restriction of the slave trade for 20 years after ratification, at which time Congress immediately outlawed the slave trade. The First Continental Congress agreed to discontinue the slave trade and boycott other nations that engaged in it, and the Second Continental Congress reaffirmed this policy. The Northwest Ordinance, a pre-Constitution law passed to govern the Western Territories and passed again by the First Congress and signed into law by President Washington, explicitly banned slavery from those territories and from any states that might be organized there. Above all, there is the clear language of the Declaration itself. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The founders knew slavery was incompatible with that truth. It is important to remember that as a question of practical politics, no durable union could have been formed without a compromise among the states on the issue of slavery. Is it reasonable to believe that slavery could have been abolished sooner had the slave states not been in a union with the free? Perhaps, but what is momentous is that a people that included slaveholders founded their nation on the proposition that all men are created equal. So why did they say that without immediately abolishing slavery? To establish the principle of consent as the ground of all political legitimacy and to check against any possible future drift toward or return to despotism, for sure, but also, in Lincoln's words, to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. The foundation of our republic planted the seeds of the death of slavery in America. The Declaration's unqualified proclamation of human equality flatly contradicted the existence of human bondage, and along with the Constitution's compromises, understood in light of that proposition, set the stage for abolition. Indeed, the movement to abolish slavery that first began in the United States led the way in bringing about the end of legal slavery. Benjamin Franklin was president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, and John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was the president of a similar society in New York. John Adams opposed slavery his entire life as a foul contagion in the human character and an evil of colossal magnitude. Frederick Douglass had been born a slave but escaped and eventually became a prominent spokesman for the abolitionist movement. He initially condemned the Constitution, but after studying its history, came to insist that it was a glorious liberty document and that the Declaration of Independence was the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny. And yet, over the course of the first half of the 19th century, a growing number of Americans increasingly denied the truth at the heart of the founding. Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina famously rejected the Declaration's principle of equality as the most dangerous of all political error and a self-evident lie. He never doubted that the founders meant what they said. To this rejection, Calhoun added a new theory in which rights inhere not in every individual by the laws of the nature and of nature's God, but in groups or races according to historical evolution. This new theory was developed to protect slavery. Calhoun claimed it was a positive good, and specifically to prevent lawful majorities from stopping the spread of slavery into federal territories where it did not yet exist. In the way our fathers originally left the slavery question, the institution was in the course of ultimate extinction, and the public mind rested in the belief that it was in the course of ultimate extinction. Abraham Lincoln observed in 1858, "All I have asked or desired anywhere is that it should be placed back again upon the basis that the fathers of our government originally placed it upon." This conflict was resolved, but at the cost of more than 600,000 lives. Constitutional amendments were passed to abolish slavery, grant equal protection under the law, and guarantee the right to vote regardless of race. Yet the damage done by the denial of core American principles and by the attempted substitution of a theory of group rights in their place proved widespread and long-lasting. These indeed are the direct ancestors of some of the destructive theories that today divide our people and tear at the fabric of our country. Progressivism. In the decades that followed the Civil War, in response to the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of urban society, many American elites developed and adopted a series of ideas to address these changes called progressivism. Although not all of one piece and not without its practical merits, the political thought of progressivism held that the times had moved far beyond the founding era and that contemporary society was too complex any longer to be governed by principles formulated in the 18th century. To use a contemporary analogy, progressives believed that America's original software, the founding documents, were no longer capable of operating America's vastly more complex hardware, the advanced industrial society that had emerged since the founding. More significantly, the progressives held that truths were not permanent, but only relative to their time. They rejected the self-evident truth of the Declaration that all men are created equal and are endowed equally either by nature or by God with unchanging rights. As one prominent progressive historian wrote in 1922, to ask whether the natural rights philosophy of the Declaration of Independence is true or false is essentially a meaningless question. Instead, progressives believed there were only group rights that are constantly redefined and change with the times. Indeed, society has the power and obligation not only to define and grant new rights, but also to take old rights away as the country develops. Based on this false understanding of rights, the progressives designed a new system of government. Instead of securing fundamental rights grounded in nature, government, operating under a new theory of the living constitution, should constantly evolve to secure evolving rights. In order to keep up with these changes, government would be run more and more by credentialed managers who would direct society through rules and regulations that mold to the currents of the time. Before he became president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson laid out this new system whereby the functions of government are in a very real sense independent of legislation and even constitutions, meaning that this new view of government would operate independent of the people. Far from creating an omniscient body of civil servants led only by pragmatism or science, though progressives instead created what amounts to a fourth branch of government, called at times the bureaucracy or the administrative state. This shadow government never faces elections and today operates largely without checks and balances. The founders always opposed government unaccountable to the people and without constitutional restraint, yet it continues to grow around us. Fascism. The principles of the Declaration have been threatened not only at home. In the 20th century, two global movements threatened to destroy freedom and subject mankind to a new slavery. Though ideological cousins, the forces of fascism and communism were bitter enemies in their wars to achieve world domination. What united both totalitarian movements was their utter disdain for natural rights and free peoples. Fascism first arose in Italy under the dictatorship of Benito Mussolini, largely in response to the rise of Bolshevism in Russia. Like the progressives, Mussolini sought to centralize power under the management of so-called experts. All power, corporate and political, would be exercised by the state and directed toward the same goal. Individual rights and freedoms hold no purchase under fascism. Its principle is instead, in Mussolini's words, everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Eventually, Adolf Hitler in Germany led this militant and dehumanizing political movement to a pseudo-scientific theory of Aryan racial supremacy, and Nazism was born. The Nazi juggernaut quickly conquered much of Europe. The rule of the Axis powers is not a government based upon the consent of the governed, said President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It is not a union of ordinary, self-respecting men and women to protect themselves and their freedom and their dignity from oppression. It's an unholy alliance of power and pelf to dominate and enslave the human race. Before the Nazis could threaten America in our own hemisphere, the United States built an arsenal of democracy, creating more ships, planes, tanks, and munitions than any other power on Earth. Eventually, America rose up, sending millions of troops across the ocean to preserve freedom. Everywhere American troops went, they embodied in their own ranks and brought with them the principles of the Declaration, liberating peoples and restoring freedom. Yet, while fascism died in 1945 with the collapse of the Axis powers, it was quickly replaced by a new threat, and the rest of the 20th century was defined by the United States' mortal and moral battleground against the forces of communism. Communism seems to preach a radical or extreme form of human equality, but at its core, wrote Karl Marx, is the idea of the class struggle as the immediate driving force of history, and particularly the class struggle between the bourgeois and the proletariat. In the communist mind, people are not born equal and free. They're defined entirely by their class. Under communism, the purpose of government is not to secure rights at all. Instead, the goal is for a class struggle that necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. But its very nature, this class struggle would be violent. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims, Marx wrote. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. This radical rejection of human dignity spread throughout much of the world. In Russia, the bloody Bolshevik Revolution during World War I established the Communist Soviet Union. Communism understands itself as a universalist movement of global conquest, and communist dictatorships eventually seized power through much of Europe and Asia and in significant parts of Africa and South America. Led by the Soviet Union, communism even threatened or aspired to threaten our liberties here at home. What it could not achieve through force of arms, it attempted through subversion. Communism did not succeed in fomenting revolution in America, but communism's relentless anti-American, anti-Western, and atheistic propaganda did inspire thousands, and perhaps millions, to reject and despise the principles of our founding and our government. While America and its allies eventually won the Cold War, this legacy of anti-Americanism is by no means entirely a memory, but still pervades much of academia and the intellectual and cultural spheres. The increasingly accepted economic theory of socialism, while less violent than communism, is inspired by the same flawed philosophy and leads down the same dangerous path of allowing the state to seize private property and redistribute wealth as the governing elite sees fit. For generations, America stood as a bulwark against global communism. Our Cold War victory was owing not only to our superior technology, economy, and military. In the end, America won because the Soviet Union was built upon a lie. As President Ronald Reagan said, "I have seen the rise of fascism and communism, but both theories fail. Both deny those God-given liberties that are the inalienable rights of each person on this planet. Indeed, they deny the existence of God." All right, folks, that will be the end for this evening, and we will go ahead and start part 3 then with racism and identity politics. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great night.